She never imagined that a single day could change the course of her life forever. The world saw her as ordinary, even invisible, but no one knew the quiet strength she carried behind her gentle eyes. Maria lived in a small apartment in a part of the city where life moved slowly, where neighbors greeted each other with nods and smiles, and the sounds of children playing in the streets were the backdrop to every evening. Her days were simple. She worked at a tiny bakery, waking before dawn to knead dough and prepare trays of fresh bread. The job was exhausting, but she found comfort in the rhythm of it, the smell of warm pastries, the smiles of customers who came not for luxury, but for the familiarity of her kindness. Every penny she earned went toward keeping her small world together, paying bills, buying a modest meal, and occasionally a tiny treat for herself. Her life was quiet and predictable, but it carried a constant weight. Maria was overweight, and in a world that celebrated thinness, she felt invisible. People whispered, stared, and sometimes mocked. She had grown used to being overlooked, brushing off cruel comments with a polite smile. Still, at night, when she sat alone in her tiny apartment, the loneliness pressed in. She longed not just for love, but for someone to see her, to recognize her worth beyond appearances. Meanwhile, across the city, Daniel lived a life most could only dream of. He was a millionaire, a man whose wealth and status opened every door. But his life was also built on arrogance and games. He measured power in influence and pleasure, and he often entertained himself with cruel bets that involved other people's lives. Daniel believed money could bend the world to his will, and he had yet to meet anyone who could challenge that belief. One evening, at a lavish party filled with laughter and clinking glasses, Daniel made a reckless bet with his friends. He claimed he could marry anyone, and the world would bow to his power. One friend suggested a poor, overlooked woman from a nearby neighborhood. Daniel accepted, not because he admired her, but because he wanted to prove a point. The woman they chose was Maria. The arrangement was shocking. A man who had everything marrying a woman who had nothing. Daniel's friends laughed, certain that she would crumble under the weight of wealth, status, and judgment. Maria, unaware of the bet's cruelty, agreed to the marriage out of necessity. It offered her security, a chance to live without constant worry. She entered the marriage quietly, carrying only hope and dignity. The wedding day was a spectacle. Maria wore a simple dress, her nervous hands trembling. She felt out of place among the glittering guests, the expensive flowers, and the sparkling jewelry. The whispers followed her everywhere. Daniel, confident and detached, played his role perfectly, smiling for the cameras, his eyes hiding a mixture of amusement and disdain. What happened next reminded everyone that kindness often arrives quietly. As the days passed, Maria faced the harsh reality of her new life. The household staff treated her as an intruder. Daniel's friends mocked her behind her back. Social gatherings were a battlefield of judgment, and even Daniel himself often treated her as if she were a game piece. Despite this, Maria's quiet strength never faltered. She greeted everyone with warmth, she listened, and she offered small acts of care that went unnoticed by most. A cup of tea prepared just right, a thoughtful note left for a staff member, a gentle smile that seemed to linger longer than it should. Daniel watched silently, more often than he realized. At first, he was amused. The contrast between his expectations and her reality entertained him. But slowly, he began to notice something he hadn't counted on. Maria was not broken. She carried herself with dignity. Her laughter, soft and genuine, had a way of piercing the emptiness in the grand halls. Her kindness, though subtle, made the cold house feel warmer. The ripple of her actions started quietly. A housemaid who had been bitter and tired found herself smiling more. A neighbor who had been suspicious of her suddenly respected her presence. Even Daniel's friends, who had come to mock, began to see the absurdity of measuring worth only by wealth. Maria's life, lived in small, unnoticed acts of humanity, was slowly reshaping the world around her. Maria herself was unaware of the subtle shifts. She focused on simple routines, the tiny comforts she could offer, and the grace she could maintain in the face of hardship. But inside, she felt something changing too. The isolation and judgment that had weighed her down began to lift, replaced by a quiet sense of purpose. She realized that her value was not defined by others' laughter or cruelty. She began to understand that her life, though small in the eyes of the world, could still hold enormous meaning. And Daniel, the man who had entered the marriage to prove his dominance, found himself unsettled. The bet, once a symbol of control, was losing its hold. He felt a strange tug in his chest when Maria smiled at the struggling bakery boy delivering supplies, when she patiently taught a confused maid, or when she quietly helped an elderly neighbor carry groceries. He couldn't name it at first, but he was learning that wealth could buy influence, but it could not buy the warmth, the resilience, or the goodness Maria exuded effortlessly. By the end of the first chapter of their shared life, one thing was clear. Maria's small acts of kindness, her patience, and her unwavering dignity were beginning to reveal cracks in Daniel's armor. The house that had once echoed with laughter and indulgence now felt different. There was a softness, an awakening that no amount of money could create. And though neither of them could yet see the full impact, the seeds of transformation had quietly been sown. The world around them, measured in status, gossip, and judgment, was starting to recognize that true value often hides in the most ordinary, overlooked lives. Maria's life was proof that kindness, though silent and humble, could quietly change everything. The days turned into weeks, and life inside the grand house began to shift in ways no one had expected. Daniel, once so confident in his superiority, found himself watching Maria with a mixture of curiosity and unease. He noticed the way she moved through the house with quiet grace, how she remembered small details about everyone, from the gardener's favorite tea to the way the chauffeur liked his mornings. Each tiny act was unnoticed by most, but Daniel couldn't help but feel its effect. Maria, for her part, continued her life with simplicity. She still woke early, prepared breakfast for the household, and tended to the small routines that kept her world steady. But she also began to look beyond the walls of the mansion. She visited the local bakery she once worked at, leaving bread and sweets for the staff who had known her before wealth had touched her life. She quietly donated to the community, helped neighbors carry heavy bags, and offered a listening ear to anyone who needed it. Each act was small, almost invisible, but it carried weight far beyond what she realized. Daniel's friends, who had come to watch the bet unfold with amusement, now found themselves puzzled. The woman they had expected to crumble under judgment was thriving quietly, bringing warmth to a house that had been cold and arrogant. Even the staff began to soften. The cook, who had been impatient and short-tempered, started taking cues from Maria, learning patience and humility. The younger servants began to mirror her kindness in their own ways. The house, once a place of competition and ego, slowly became a space of care and connection. One evening, Daniel found himself alone with Maria in the garden. The air was cool, and the city lights flickered softly in the distance. He watched her as she tended to a small patch of flowers, her hands gentle as she pruned the plants. For a moment, he saw her not as a symbol of a bet, not as a woman he thought he could control, but as a human being with depth, courage, and warmth. Something inside him shifted. He felt a pang of regret for the way he had treated her, for the bet, for the arrogance that had guided his choices. What happened next reminded everyone that kindness often arrives quietly. It started with a simple gesture. Maria noticed a young intern struggling to carry a stack of papers, and without a word, she took half the load, walked beside him, and offered encouragement. Daniel saw it happen and felt an unfamiliar warmth. It wasn't flashy or dramatic. It was just a small act of care. But in that moment, he began to understand something he had never considered. Influence without empathy is empty. Wealth without kindness is hollow. Over the next months, Daniel's life changed in subtle ways. He began to engage differently with the people around him. He stopped mocking, stopped trying to prove power through dominance. He listened more, watched more, and slowly, he learned that humility could carry more weight than pride. Maria never asked for change, she never demanded attention. Her strength was in simply being herself, living her life with dignity, and treating others with quiet care. That was enough to reshape the world around her, including Daniel. The ripple effect spread further than anyone expected. Maria's friends, inspired by her resilience, began to perform their own small acts of kindness. The bakery she had once worked at started a program to feed struggling families, inspired by her donations. Even the neighbors, who had initially judged her, began to see the value of compassion over appearances. The small mansion, which had once been a stage for a bet and arrogance, became a symbol of transformation, a place where human dignity was honored above wealth. Daniel and Maria's relationship evolved naturally. It wasn't sudden or romantic in the way movies portray it. It was slow, grounded in understanding, trust, and shared humanity. Daniel learned to admire Maria not for the bet she had been part of, but for her courage, patience, and the way she carried herself through judgment without bitterness. Maria, in turn, noticed the genuine change in him, the way he had begun to shed arrogance and embrace empathy. What started as a cruel game turned into a profound lesson for both. Maria's life had taught Daniel that the value of a person is never measured in money, appearances, or status. True worth is seen in kindness, in resilience, in the quiet strength to face the world with dignity and compassion. And for Maria, the experience affirmed that no matter the cruelty or judgment from others, living authentically and with care can inspire change far beyond one's immediate world. By the time the first year of their marriage came to a close, the household had transformed completely. Laughter became genuine, conversations were filled with warmth, and small acts of care became the norm. Daniel's friends, who had once mocked, began to respect Maria in ways they had never respected anyone before. And Daniel himself, once blind to the emptiness of his own life, discovered a new sense of fulfillment. In the quiet evenings when the city was still and the lights cast a gentle glow, Daniel would often sit and watch Maria tend to the flowers, preparing meals for the staff, or simply offering aid. Smile to someone in need. He understood now that wealth could never replace the power of a kind heart. Maria had not only changed him, she had changed everyone around her, proving that compassion spreads quietly, touches deeply, and leaves a lasting impact. Life is rarely about grand gestures or dramatic revelations. Sometimes the most profound transformations happen in small, unnoticed ways. Maria's life was proof that dignity, kindness, and quiet strength can conquer prejudice, arrogance, and judgment. She had faced the world as it saw her, endured its cruelty, and in doing so, She taught everyone around her what it truly means to be human. And as the story of their lives continued, one truth remained clear. A single act of kindness, no matter how small, can ripple through the world in ways we cannot imagine. It can heal, inspire, and transform lives, including those we never thought could change. If this story touched your heart, subscribe, because kindness deserves to be shared.